All right, welcome to today's class. So today we're going to talk about time travel and free will. How many of you have seen Back to the Future? Oh, excellent. I was worried that maybe I had been trapped in the 80s and wouldn't be able to give my example properly. OK, so I want to start by talking about Back to the Future, because Back to the Future is an excellent example of an inconsistent time travel story. And I'm going to tell you guys why. So here's what happens in the movie very, very roughly. So at the start of the movie, we're told about this guy, George McFly, who leads a horrible life. So in particular, nobody respects him. Like, he has a horrible boss and so forth. And then his son, Marty, gets into a time machine and travels to the past. And as they put it in the movie, he interferes. So all sorts of weird things happen, including that Marty's mom gets a crush on him. And he's, as the movie portrays it, he's in danger of never being born for that reason. But anyway, he befriends his own father and gives him courage. And then Marty comes back to the future and finds that his dad is respected by everyone. And in fact, the guy who was his horrible boss now works for him, or something like that. Now, here is why the movie is inconsistent. Because there's a particular time in 1985, I forget the exact date, such that at the beginning of the movie, we're told that in 1985, George gets no respect. And then, towards the end of the film, we're told of this same time, we're told that everyone respects George. Now, it doesn't matter whether this statement is made at the beginning of the film and that statement is made at the end of the film. The two statements are still inconsistent. I mean, to see this, suppose that you're on a jury, and at the beginning of his testimony, the witness says that George gets no respect at a certain time, and at the end of his testimony, the witness says that everyone respects George at that same time. Then you would conclude that the witness has contradicted himself. Now, there is an interpretation of the film where it's not inconsistent. The problem is that it's also not about time travel. So on this other interpretation, what happens is not that Marty is traveling through time in our world. What happens instead is that he's traveling across worlds. So what happens is that he goes to the past. So this is our world. That's 1985. And he goes to the past and then interferes. And at that point, he moves to a different world that has a slightly different future. Now, but notice how there's something odd about interpreting the story in that way. Because on that interpretation, the movie is a total downer. So on that interpretation, what happens is that Marty abandons his real family, goes off to a different world filled with copies, and hangs out with his happy copies, where his family, his real family, is sad. In fact, they're probably sadder now that Marty has abandoned them. So on the interpretation that the movie is to be understood not as a world travel story, but as a time travel story, it's inconsistent. So 2 quick exercises for you guys. So I'm going to mention 2 stories, and I want you guys to tell me whether they're consistent or inconsistent. So first story, I'm a terrible gambler, And one morning at the tracks, I feel this feeling, and I decide that I'm gonna bet everything on Easy Rider. And I place my bet, and Easy Rider loses by a nose. And so I lose all my savings and lead this life of hardship. But towards the end of my life, an old aunt dies, and she leaves me a time machine. So I go back, and I see my younger self waiting in line to buy the crucial ticket. And then I whisper into his ear, don't bet on Easy Rider. And my younger self acquiesces and never places the bet, and I'm happy thereafter. So consistent or inconsistent? That's right. OK, second story. It's the eve of your 21st birthday. And the doorbell rings, and a stranger shows up. And they tell you how to build a time machine. So you follow their instructions and build the time machine, and it's awesome. You spend your life traveling through time. And towards the end of your life, once you're old, you go back in time to the eve of your 21st birthday and tell your younger self how to build a time machine. Consistent or inconsistent? That's right. Weird, but consistent. OK, the reason it's consistent is because that doesn't happen. So there is no time about which we're first told that one thing happens, and that's later taken back. We're later told that, no, something else happened. Yes?
Doesn't that create a paradox? I mean, maybe paradox, I don't know if that's the right word, I guess I'll find out in this class, but doesn't that create a paradox of, where the knowledge of how to build a time machine initiated?
Yes. No, there is something definitely weird about that case. So, just to expand on what you said. So, normally, when a scientific discovery takes place, is because, we looked at nature and did a lot of work, and it was the result of that work that we learned how to do something. But in this case, it seems like there was no real learning. So there's this bit of information that my younger self has because my older self told him. And the only reason my older self has it in the first place is because he remembers it from his younger years when he himself gave him the information. So there's something weird about it. Another way of seeing what's weird about it is that there's something that causes itself. Because you can say, OK, so what causes my younger self to have the information? Well, my older self. OK, but what causes him to have the information? Well, the fact that my younger self had it. So there's a loop. So there's something very weird, and certainly something that doesn't seem physically possible. But it's not inconsistent because it doesn't entail a contradiction. So that brings us to something which is very important. One thing we're not doing today is exploring the issue of whether time travel is physically possible. So the question is not whether there's a solution to Einstein's equations that permits time travel. What we're discussing is, as it were, the concept of time travel. So what we want to know is whether the concept itself allows for coherent reasoning. The kind of case that you bring up is important because it shows that even if the concept itself turns out to be consistent, there might be some weirdness associated with it, and maybe that's weirdness that gets in the way with a physical theory that makes room for time travel. So it's an important conclusion. It's a valuable lesson. Yes?
Yeah, I'm not really sure how to phrase this. It seems weird, but back to the Future example, I feel like it might be okay to say what is true at 1985 changes. So it's not the case that both in 1985 George gets respect and George doesn't get respect. It's that, like, I'm going to use the word time, which is the wrong word to use, but it's like in 1985 George gets no respect, and then later in time, that fact changes, and so they're no longer both true. It's just like, I suppose at the end of the movie, like everyone's like memories change or something like that. But yeah.
I love that question. I love that question, and I think that the fact that you weren't sure what words to use to describe it is important, because I think that in order to give that kind of answer, one would in effect need two different notions of time. So one would need a first notion of time that's the one that this line represents, and that's like ordinary time. And then you would have to have something like super time. And then maybe what happens is that, so maybe we represent super time this way. So as super time progresses, what the timeline is like changes. So I agree. I think that is a different way of thinking of it. So had I been more careful, I would have said that in order to interpret the story consistently, it has to be a story about time travel as opposed to world travel. And also, it has to presuppose that there is a single notion of time. Now, it's hard to know what to think of the idea that supertime exists. I mean, one thing to point out is that if there is such a thing as supertime, then ordinary folk like ourselves never witness it in any way, because the experience that we have of time corresponds to traveling in this direction. So it would seem to be this additional posit that goes beyond what we have direct evidence for. But I think that's a very good point. Okay. So let me now tell you about the grandfather paradox. And again, we want to find out whether there is an inconsistency there or whether it's just weird. Okay, so this is a grandfather paradox. Consider Bruno. Bruno really hates his grandfather. I mean, he really hates him. And for good reason, because his grandfather was a horrible man. So he was a drunk, for starters, a gambler, a womanizer, and he orchestrated a fraud that left millions of people in poverty. So Bruno has made it his life's mission to kill grandfather. Alas, grandfather died many years before Bruno's death. So Bruno decides to build a time machine to go to the past and kill grandfather then. So say that he succeeds and builds a time machine and goes to the past. And we're assuming that he travels to a time before grandfather had any children. And Bruno he's thought about the details. So he bought himself a sniper's rifle and he's trained himself to use it. And he tracks grandfather's movements for a few weeks and notices that every Saturday he takes a walk. So he finds a good location on the belfry of the steeple and aims his rifle at grandfather. Grandfather stops to tie his shoelace, so Bruno gets a clear shot. And what happens?
In order for it to be consistent, he has to miss, right?
Correct. In order for it to be consistent, he has to miss. Because otherwise, we would just have a version of that. I would have told you at the beginning of my narrative that grandfather was a grandfather, and therefore that he lived long enough to have children. And then later in the narrative, I'm telling you that before he had children, someone killed him. I mean, admittedly, I'm assuming that weird things don't happen, so I'm assuming that it doesn't happen that he revives, or that a DNA sample was taken and that was used to absent things like those. You're absolutely right. The story would be inconsistent. So it follows from what I've said that Bruno is going to miss. And what's weird is that we've been given no reason for explaining why he might miss. So, I said that he has a super rifle and that, he has a clear shot and he's trained himself to use the rifle. So why is he going to miss? The story doesn't settle that. If I were to continue the story, I would have to say something like that, he lost his nerve, or that, in fact, there was a banana peel nearby and, he slipped on it, or something happened. Okay, so I think we can conclude that I have not contradicted myself, and not just that there's a way of extending the story so that I give you additional details and still don't contradict myself. But this raises an additional question, because it's natural to think that on pain of contradiction, Bruno had to miss. He couldn't have killed grandfather. So I'm going to write that down. Bruno couldn't have succeeded. One second. But if he couldn't have succeeded, then one might think that Bruno was not free, because it's natural to assume that you only acted freely if you could have done otherwise. Okay.
Would it be reasonable to say that he already failed, so asking for a reason why he failed isn't as relevant?
I think you're right. So I think that, so for example, here's a way of spelling out your point. Suppose that as part of his research, Bruno had read the local news reports. So then he would have known that there was an assassination attempt on grandfather and that it failed. So even before starting, Bruno knows how it's going to turn up. In fact, that reminds me of something that I was hoping to tell you guys about. Do people know about the Time Travelers Convention that was held at MIT in 2005? Oh, the coolest things in the universe. So for people who don't know, the way it worked is that some East Campus people spread the word that there would be a convention. And what was amazing is that they managed to get the press to report on it before it happened. So for example, the New York Times published a piece. So then the plan was that because there was real news coverage, people in the future would have access to it. And if they were able to build time machines, they might say, well, there's a convention, why not attend? And it would be awesome, because if they show up, I mean, not just someone from the future, but they could teach us how to build time machines. I really think it's the coolest thing in the universe to come up with that. They made a nice event of it, so they got all these famous MIT professors to show up and give talks. And what happened is that nobody from the future showed up. Or at least nobody showed up and announced that they were from the future. So this might be related to what you were saying, because suppose that the future comes and people do design time machines. They can just read the reports that were written after the event and know that they're not going to show up. From Bruno's point of view and from these people's point of view, reading about past events can give them information about what they would think of as their personal future. Yeah?
If Bruno reads a news report saying that there was an attempt, he still has to go and do it. He has to still go and...
Yes, that's right. If this is to be consistent, he knows that he's going to end up doing it. He doesn't know how, and maybe he has the intention of not doing it. But maybe he will slip into the time machine. Maybe someone will give him a drug. So we have another version of the same situation. That it just follows from the story that he's going to do certain things.
Give him a drug.
On pain of inconsistency. Okay, so really the next topic is, what shall we conclude from that? So suppose that in a case like that, it's determined by the story what you're going to do. And maybe you even know what you're going to do. Does it follow that you don't have free will because you couldn't have done otherwise? So I mean, just to bring out that intuition. So suppose that someone forces a gun into my hand and then forces me to pull the trigger. So in a court of law, I would not be found guilty of murder because although my finger did cause someone to die, let us say, I was not acting freely when my finger moved in that way. So it's natural to think that if it's true that Bruno couldn't have succeeded, he was not acting freely. Yeah?
So I think maybe the case that even though you have this information that, like, you know, you're going to go back in time to do this thing, that you still decide to do it. There's a similar thought experiment where they say you have like some super psychologist that can he has like all these electrodes up to your brain, and like he can predict with like extreme accuracy, like 100% accuracy, like what you're going to do next. I mean, I would say it's still the case that I decided what I'm going to, or at least it could be said that it's still the case that I decided what I'm going to do next. And those seem very similar to me, that like I decided even though, you know, someone else knew I was going to decide.
Nice, nice. And let me mention a variant of that. So current physics is probably not deterministic. It's not obvious that it's not, by the way. So there are interpretations of quantum mechanics, Bohmian interpretations, according to which quantum mechanics is deterministic. But on a standard interpretation of quantum mechanics, current physics is not deterministic. But let's consider the following question, and this is closely connected to what you said. Just assume that we live in a world in which the laws of physics are deterministic in the following sense. If you were to have full information about the state of the world at a particular time, then you could use the laws to generate perfect predictions about what the state of the world will be like at any future time. And maybe the laws are even two-way deterministic, in which case you could also generate perfect predictions about the state of the world at any past time. So here is a question. If we live in such a world, does that mean that there is no free will? So someone equipped with enough information knows exactly what's going to happen. So maybe I'm now deciding whether to let go of the eraser, and you've looked at the laws and you know what's going to happen, but I still feel like I'm making a decision. And then I decide to drop it. So did I not act freely for that reason? Do you want to? Yeah, sure.
I think we need a more refined definition of free will to continue talking about this.
I totally agree. So let me tell you, well, this is in fact a tricky issue, because here's what would be nice. What would be nice is if we had a definition of freedom that everyone agreed with, and then we just use that definition to settle the issue. But this is a philosophy class, so things are going to be more complicated. Let me start with a preliminary definition, and let's see let's go with that one to see what happens. But it turns out that that's the definition that's going to be contested. Okay, so here's the preliminary definition. S acted freely if and only if in so acting, he could have done otherwise. So let's work with that definition. Then in a deterministic world, there is a sense of could whereby nobody could have done anything different. The sense of could is one in which you leave fixed the initial conditions of the universe and the laws. So there is no way for the world to be in which the same initial conditions obtain, the same laws obtain, and you do something different. So if that's the sense of could that you bring into this definition, then there is no free will. Yeah?
Just an interesting corollary to that is if you went with that assumption that like you could do something else, then you have to assume that time is being created like afresh. Because if it's already happened in the future, then it's not exactly free choice because you could not have done otherwise. So you'd have to define time in such a way that nothing has happened until it has been experienced in the present.
Yeah, no, you're right. You're right. Something like we would get something very, very yucky, wouldn't we, if we don't modify something. Now, here is an example that has convinced me that, in fact, this principle is not a problem. That we can respect this principle and say that we acted freely, even in a deterministic world. And we can say that Bruno acted freely. So consider this example. Suppose that you agreed to have breakfasts with a friend. And she shows up, and she looks terrible. And you say, what happened to you? And she says, I had an awful night. At one point I had decided that I was going to commit suicide. And then her phone rings, and she takes the call, and you're left wondering, well, did she commit suicide? Well, of course not. It's not that it follows from what she said, but you can see her right there. So you have information about the future with respect to her story. So you know that she didn't succeed. But does it follow that your friend didn't act freely when she decided not to go through? Of course not. Of course not. Because what you know is that she won't commit suicide. Nothing so far tells us that she couldn't have. So here, by analogy, is a way of thinking about the laws. You can think about the laws as predictors. You can think about the laws as just issuing predictions of what's going to happen in the future on the basis of what's happened in the past. But as in the case of the friend, someone who's equipped with the laws is someone who has information about what will happen. But that is not to say that they have information about what must happen. It's not to say that they know what could be decided by an agent or what could be the result of an agent's actions. It's just that by deploying the rules, they happen to have a perfect magic ball that allows them to know exactly how things are going to turn out. Yeah?
So I'm not sure I agree with that, because if you're assuming that everyone's brains operate under the deterministic laws of physics, and then you can know not only what will happen, but why it will happen, and why people will choose to do things. And so it seems like you have complete knowledge about the future.
That's absolutely right. So you will know, for example, exactly what people will decide, not just what we will do, but because you know every detail of their brains, you know like every motivation and every decision that will in fact happen. So what this means is that someone who wants to hold on to that principle and retain the view that determinism is compatible with free will is going to have to allow for what might be called a miracle. So let me explain. So go back to the friend who was thinking about committing suicide. And think about a sense in which we might informally say that she might have acted otherwise. So what actually happens is that she's feeling really sad. She considers suicide. And then she decides against. And then finally, breakfast. So that's what actually happens. And now suppose that the laws are deterministic. Then, as you say, it's not just that macro events such as these are going to continue to take place. It's also that the exact brain state, B, that she was in when she decided against it is going to take place. I'm going to add your name to the board. What's your name?
Me?
Yeah. Evan. Sorry, Evan or Kevin?
Evan.
Evan.
Yeah.
OK. So the sense in which she could have done otherwise is this. It's where we consider a different world, which is exactly like the actual world up to this time. Exactly. And then we allow a tiny violation of the laws of physics. Not a big violation. What happens is just that we allow for things in her brain to be slightly different so that she enters state B prime, which is the state in which she decides to go ahead. So a slight miracle. And then from that point on, we assume that the laws continue to be in place. So with respect to the laws of the actual world, the new world is a contra-physical world. But it's still a scenario that we can consistently describe. So we can still say exactly what happens. We can even use our laws to predict what's going to happen almost always except for this little case. So one thing one could say is that if there is a world like that, if there is a world in which a local miracle produces a different decision, and that decision leads to a different action, then the mere existence of that world is enough for it to be the case that he could have done otherwise, even if that is not the could that gets spelled out in terms of initial conditions in physical laws. So now we can come back to Evan's original question. So what's the definition of free will with respect to which we're asking whether it's consistent with physics? Well, we've suggested two. On the one hand, we have the physical proposal, where what we mean by could is that there is a way for the universe to evolve which respects initial conditions and the laws of physics, where he does otherwise. Given that definition, there is no free will. Now, here's another definition. Define could as there is a world of the kind I just described, where there's a local miracle that leads to a different behavior. So let me call that, I'm just going to call it psychological possibility. When you think of the definition this way, then free will is compatible with determinism. And now, of course, the issue is, what is the right way of thinking about free will? And some people give one answer, other people give a different answer, and there is no agreement. OK, it's your turn.
To answer, I haven't thought about this a lot, but to answer that, I think local miracles are a bit weird. Like I think if you allow for local miracles, then like you're how do I say it? You can't say I have this complete set of laws that describe how we progress from this point in time to this point in time, but then you also say, oh, but sometimes I don't have a complete set. Like you just contradicted yourself.
Oh, I don't think I agree with that for the following reason. Because on this way of thinking, we're taking the laws of physics to give us perfect predictions of what will happen. So when you predict what's going to happen, you don't have to worry about miracles. You know that they're not going to happen. That's part of what it takes for the laws to be true. There are no miracles. It's just that we don't take that to immediately settle the question of whether, say, our friend could have done otherwise. Because that's a question that just lives in a different realm. In order to answer that question, we need to know what would have happened had certain tiny miracles taken place. So the laws tell us that she won't do otherwise. It's just that maybe she could have had there been a little miracle. So what's magical about this proposal is that it is not inconsistent with anything that physics tells us. Really, this is all an exercise in finding the right way of thinking about free will. Now, here's my sense of how this debate plays out. I think that when one looks at this kind of thing for the first time, one thinks that this psychological notion of could that leads to compatibility between free will and determinism is disappointing, it's too weak. So you say, well, that there be this weird other world where a miracle takes place, like that's not enough for me to be free. Like somehow for me to be free, I have to have like a power within me that is, so intimately controlled by me that, and then you say something obscure. My sense is that once you think of it properly, you end up with a situation in which either you postulate something like this, which is clear, though perhaps disappointing, or you simply do not succeed in clarifying what you mean. Now, what I've just said is incredibly controversial. So philosophers who think that free will is incompatible with determinism would say that I have oversimplified the issue and that there is good sense to be made of the notion of free will, which is not spelled out in the way that I just described.
I'm not sure if... So you can imagine a set of physical laws where, like, for some reason you just can't know things about the brain, which I feel like that's, like, perfectly logically consistent. Like, in physics right now, we have things you just, like, can't know, right? And so you could just, yeah, that feels better to me than having local miracles. Just saying the brain is, magic, and you just can't know what happens in there.
There are some people who have tried to think about free will in this way. Now, I'm not going to argue that any such effort is going to fail, but let me describe one example of that, which I think can't work. So, suppose that you think that there is something essentially indeterministic in the way our brains work. So, contra-determinism, even if you knew the initial conditions, or at least as much of that as can be known, you just wouldn't be able to predict what I'm going to do because there is this point of indeterminacy. Well, if the indeterminacy is something like randomness, so if the indeterminacy is something like whether a certain radioactive isotope will decay, then it's not clear that that's going to help. Because look, consider the following. Imagine that someone ties my hand to a gun and sets things up so that if a certain isotope decays within a certain time frame, something's going to force me to pull the trigger. And if it doesn't, then it won't. There's something indeterministic about whether I'm going to pull the trigger. But nobody will say that I was free in doing so. I was at the mercy of a random event. So it won't do to try to illuminate free will by saying that it's to do by random events inside our brains. Because what that gives you is not free will. What that gives you is slavery to randomness.
I think you can still have free will there. You can say, like, so the laws of physics make it so that I can, like, predict what I'm going to do, like, you know, like, where my arm's going to move and all that sort of thing, but you just don't know, like, my thoughts and, like, why I'm doing that. And I think then even if you know, like, you know, I'm going to take 5 steps forward or something, but you don't know why I decided to take 5 steps forward, there's still a sense in which it can be said that I have free will.
Maybe. A disadvantage of going that way is that we would burden our understanding of free will with a hostage to empirical fortune. So we're in effect relying on our best physics to deliver, you know, just the right theory so that our account turns out to be right. And maybe we will get just the right theory, and then we'll be able to tell a story of the kind you want. But there's something weird about the idea that whether or not we're free depends on, like, the details of fundamental physics. But I agree that that is a way one might go. This principle that S acted freely if and only if he could have done otherwise. Actually, we have good reasons for thinking that that principle is false. And I'm going to give you a counterexample, and we'll just end with that and continue talking about that next time. So suppose that when I was deciding whether to drop the eraser, a moment ago, and remember that I did drop it, there was an evil scientist who was monitoring my brain activity. And had I decided not to drop the eraser, she would have interfered with my brain in a way that would have caused me to drop it anyway. So it seems like I couldn't have failed to drop it, because had I decided against it, I would have dropped it anyway. So it's not true that in acting, I could have done otherwise. But actually, the scientist didn't do anything. Actually, the scientist was just monitoring my brain. So if I was free in the original case, I would have been free in this case too, because just monitoring what someone does, one would think, doesn't interfere with their freedom. So even the basic thing that we thought we could say about free will, even that seems not to be true. So the lesson of all this is that the situation is all a mess, and we're going to have to continue talking about it next time.